What if the next fracture inside NATO doesn't begin with tanks or missiles, but with an island buried under ice? I'm Fareed Zakaria, and right now, the White House says Donald Trump and his closest advisors are openly discussing options to take control of Greenland, including, astonishingly, the use of American military power. Denmark calls it a fantasy. Greenland's leaders say, enough. But history tells us something uncomfortable. Ideas dismissed as fantasies often arrive first as warnings. Greenland looks remote, silent, almost empty. But in geopolitics, emptiness is never neutral. Trump says this isn't about minerals. He says it's about national security. He points to Russian and Chinese ships in Arctic waters. And suddenly, an island of 56,000 people becomes a pressure point for the entire Western alliance. If you want to understand how power really shifts in the 21st century, stay with me. And if this kind of clear-eyed analysis helps you see the world differently, this is the moment to subscribe. To grasp why Greenland matters so much, we first need to understand what kind of map Trump is actually looking at. To understand this moment, we need to slow it down and name the problem clearly. This is not just a dispute over territory, and it is not a spontaneous provocation. What we are seeing is a collision between two ideas of security. On one side, the traditional NATO model, shared defense, sovereignty respected, allies bound by rules. On the other, a far more transactional view of power, one where geography itself can be bought, pressured, or taken if it serves national interest. Trump argues that Greenland is essential to American security. He points north to the Arctic, to Russian and Chinese activity. He frames the issue as urgency, not expansion, protection, not possession. Denmark hears something very different. So do other NATO allies. They hear a challenge to the basic assumption that alliances are safe from coercion from the inside, because if one NATO member can threaten to take territory linked to another, even hypothetically, then the alliance is no longer just a shield. It becomes a question mark. Here's the bridge. To see how we arrived at this tension, we have to look backward at history, geography, and the long shadow Greenland has always cast over great powers. To understand this moment, we need to slow it down and name the problem clearly. This is not just a dispute over territory, and it is not a spontaneous provocation. What we are seeing is a collision between two ideas of security. On one side, the traditional NATO model, shared defense, sovereignty respected, allies bound by rules. On the other, a far more transactional view of power, one where geography itself can be bought, pressured, or taken if it serves national interest. Trump argues that Greenland is essential to American security. He points north to the Arctic, to Russian and Chinese activity. He frames the issue as urgency, not expansion, protection, not possession. Denmark hears something very different. So do other NATO allies. They hear a challenge to the basic assumption that alliances are safe from coercion from the inside. Because if one NATO member can threaten to take territory linked to another, even hypothetically, then the alliance is no longer just a shield. It becomes a question mark. Here's the bridge. To see how we arrived at this tension, we have to look backward at history, geography, and the long shadow Greenland has always cast over great powers. The first rupture didn't come quietly. It came with shock and with language that was impossible to ignore. After a US military raid in Venezuela, Donald Trump resurfaced an old idea with new force. America should take over Greenland, not negotiate quietly, not signal subtly, but assert publicly that control of the island was on the table. Greenland's prime minister called it a fantasy. Denmark said it crossed a line. But the White House went further, confirming that multiple options were being discussed, including the use of the US military. That moment mattered more than it seemed, because for the first time, a NATO superpower openly suggested coercive action linked to the territory of another NATO member, even if framed as hypothetical, even if never executed. Trump's allies doubled down. One aide said no one would fight the US over Greenland. Another suggested buying it instead. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was irrelevant. If this analysis resonates, share it, because moments like this are often misread as noise until they reshape the system. Here's the bridge. When rhetoric escalates this fast, it's rarely impulsive. To understand what's really happening, we need to look beneath the statements at the hidden mechanics driving this crisis. What looks like bravado is actually a system at work. Beneath the headlines, this is about how power is being redefined. For decades, American leadership rested on alliances. Influence flowed through trust, predictability, and shared rules. But the mechanism now being tested is different. It treats geography as an asset, security as a transaction, loyalty as conditional. In this logic, Greenland is not a partner. It is a variable. Trump's insistence that this is about national security, not minerals, is revealing. Security here is not just defense, it is denial. Denying rivals access to Arctic routes, denying them proximity to North America, denying them leverage as ice melts and the region opens. Russia and China are not invoked as enemies to be confronted together, but as threats to justify unilateral control. This is how systems shift quietly, not with declarations of empire, but with reframed incentives, buying instead of invading, pressuring instead of negotiating, normalizing the idea that allies' territory can be reassigned in the name of efficiency. Here's the bridge. When a system changes, stress always appears at the edges. The next rupture doesn't come from leaders or diplomats, but from the moment ordinary people realize the ground beneath them is no longer stable. The second crisis arrived not with threats, but with presence. High-level visits to Greenland turned tension into reality. A sitting US vice president stood on Arctic ground and accused Denmark of failing to protect the territory. Later, a special envoy was appointed, someone who spoke openly about Greenland becoming part of the United States. These were not abstract ideas anymore. They were signals, carefully placed, impossible to ignore. For NATO allies, this was the moment discomfort turned into alarm. Because power isn't measured only by what you do, it's measured by what you make thinkable. By showing up, by appointing envoys, by reframing the conversation from cooperation to acquisition, Washington shifted the center of gravity. Denmark found itself defending sovereignty not against an adversary, but against its closest ally. Other European capitals began asking the quiet question alliances fear most. What if the rules no longer protect us? This is how pressure works in modern geopolitics. It doesn't explode, it accumulates. It forces smaller actors to react, to clarify, to resist, while the stronger side insists it is only being practical. Here's the bridge. When systems collide at this level, the real cost is rarely paid by governments. It's paid by people. And that's where this story turns personal. If you live in Greenland, this debate doesn't feel strategic. It feels intimate. You hear powerful countries talk about your home as if it were empty space, as if 56,000 lives were a footnote, as if history, language, and identity could be folded into a security memo. You want independence, many Greenlanders do, but not like this, not by being pulled from one capital to another. You watch leaders argue over your future on television. You hear phrases like national security and common adversaries, and you realize something unsettling. None of those words describe you. They describe systems, interests, maps drawn far away. When Greenland's Prime Minister says no more pressure, that isn't defiance, it's exhaustion. It's the demand to be seen as a people, not a prize. If this story moves you, share it, because geopolitics often erases human voices, and attention is sometimes the only defense. Here's the bridge. What's happening in Greenland doesn't stay in Greenland. When alliances strain, the shockwaves travel outward, across borders, across oceans, across the world. When alliances crack, the world notices immediately. Greenland sits at the intersection of continents, but also at the intersection of rivalries. Any shift in its status sends a signal far beyond the Arctic. Russia watches closely, seeing confirmation that Western unity is fragile. China, already accused by Trump of expanding its presence, studies the lesson. Power doesn't just confront enemies, it tests friends. For NATO, this is dangerous terrain. The alliance is built on a simple promise: security through solidarity. But when one member pressures territory linked to another, that promise starts to blur. Smaller states begin to wonder whether guarantees are absolute or conditional, whether rules apply equally or bend for the strongest. Denmark's warning that such a move could end the transatlantic alliance is not rhetoric. It is a recognition of domino effects. Trust erodes, coordination weakens, rivals exploit hesitation. This is how global systems destabilize, not through sudden collapse, but through accumulated doubt. Here's the bridge. Once doubt takes hold, the future opens into multiple paths. None are inevitable, but all are shaped by the choices being made right now. When a system reaches this point, the future doesn't arrive as a single outcome. It fractures into scenarios. The first path is restraint. Pressure gives way to dialogue. The United States reaffirms that security in the Arctic must be shared, not seized. Greenland deepens cooperation without surrendering agency. NATO absorbs the shock and emerges more disciplined, clearer about its red lines. This is the best outcome. It preserves trust even after strain. The second path is ambiguity. The rhetoric continues. Envoys remain. Visits multiply. Nothing is taken, but nothing is resolved. Greenland lives under constant strategic tension. Denmark feels exposed. NATO survives, but thinner, functional, yet hollowed by suspicion. This is how alliances age. The third path is escalation. Norms break. Coercion becomes precedent. If territory linked to one ally can be openly targeted by another, the alliance's moral core collapses. Rivals don't need to defeat NATO. They simply wait for it to unravel from within. History tells us this much. Systems don't fail because of one decision. They fail because leaders mistake leverage for legitimacy. Here's the bridge. Which future we enter depends on what we choose to defend, not just territory, but principles. And that brings us to the end of this story. This story ends where every serious geopolitical story should end not with certainty, but with responsibility. Greenland is not just about ice or bases or ships moving quietly through Arctic waters. It is about whether power in the 21st century is restrained by rules or liberated from them. Whether alliances are moral commitments or temporary conveniences. Donald Trump's interest in Greenland forces a question NATO has avoided for years. What happens when the greatest threat to an alliance comes from inside its own logic of power? If security justifies everything, then nothing is off limits. Not pressure, not coercion, not the quiet rewriting of norms that once kept allies from becoming rivals. But if principles still matter, sovereignty, consent, restraint, then this moment becomes a line, not a slide. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and if you want to understand where the world is going, you have to watch moments like this closely. Share this analysis. Subscribe for what comes next. Because the Arctic may look distant, but the rules being tested there will shape the future everywhere. And in the next video, we'll ask the harder question. If alliances are changing, who is already preparing for the world that comes after?